A courtroom in Santa Fe. Fluorescent light on wood paneling. A folder sits closed on a table. Inside that folder, 7.5 million files. Not photographs of vacations, not screenshots of memes. 7.5 million pieces of child sexual abuse material, flagged and sitting inside Meta's own internal review system. That number did not come from a whistleblower. It did not come from a leaked memo smuggled out of Menlo Park. It came out during sworn testimony, in a public courtroom, in a lawsuit filed by the state of New Mexico, against one of the most powerful technology companies on earth. This is the story of how a small state Department of Justice built a case against Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, using decoy accounts, undercover investigators, and 2 years of courtroom battles. It is the story of a jury that found the company committed 75,000 separate violations of state law. And it is the story of a judge who looked at the evidence and ruled that Facebook and Instagram are, by legal definition, a public nuisance. This case is now considered a landmark. Legal experts are calling it the first time in American history a court has held a major social media company financially and structurally liable for harm done to children. To understand how New Mexico got here, we have to go back to December 2023, and an operation that began with a set of fake accounts. In December 2023, New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres filed a civil lawsuit against Meta Platforms and its CEO Mark Zuckerberg. The lawsuit landed only weeks after 33 other states had already sued Meta over allegations that its products carried psychological risks for children and teenagers. But New Mexico's case was different. It wasn't built primarily on expert testimony or internal research documents. It was built on evidence the state's own investigators had gone out and collected themselves. Attorney General Torres said his office had uncovered what it described as significant failures in child protection through an undercover investigation. The Department of Justice created a series of decoy accounts, each one built to represent a child 14 years old or younger. These were not abstract test profiles sitting dormant on a server. They were placed on Facebook and Instagram, exactly the way a real child's account would appear, and then investigators waited to see what would happen. What happened, according to the state, was fast, and according to Torres, deeply alarming. The decoy accounts began receiving sexual solicitations. Investigators documented each one. The messages, the accounts sending them, the platform features that allowed contact between adult strangers and accounts registered to minors. Then the state's team did something equally important. They reported what they were seeing to Meta directly, and they tracked exactly how and how quickly the company responded. According to the state's findings, the response fell short. New Mexico's Department of Justice alleged that Meta's handling of these reports showed a pattern of prioritizing engagement and profit over the safety of the minors on its platforms. The undercover operation did more than build a civil case. It led to criminal charges. In 2024, Attorney General Torres announced felony charges against 3 men accused of using Meta's platforms to target and solicit sex with children who did not exist. Children who were in fact decoy accounts built by his own office. The men had allegedly connected with these accounts through Facebook Messenger, exchanging explicit material and expressing clear sexual interest in what they believed were underage users. Torres did not hide his reaction. He told reporters it was, in his words, extraordinarily concerning how easily these individuals had located the undercover personas his office had created. If professional investigators could stand up a handful of fake accounts and draw on predators that quickly, the state's legal theory asked the simple question: what happens when it isn't a controlled operation? What happens when it's a real 14-year-old with a real account and no state investigator watching in the background? That question became the foundation of the civil suit. New Mexico accused Meta of building what its filing called a marketplace, a breeding ground engineered, whether intentionally or through neglect, to put predators in direct reach of children, all while failing to disclose to the public what the company internally knew about those risks. Meta moved to dismiss the case in March 2024, arguing the Santa Fe court lacked personal jurisdiction over the company. The case would proceed to trial. Before the trial ever reached a jury, the court made a structural decision that would define the next 2 years of litigation. It divided the case into 2 separate phases. Phase 1 would be a jury trial. Its job, determine whether Meta had violated New Mexico's Unfair Practices Act. a consumer protection law that makes it illegal for companies to deceive the public about their products. Phase 2 would be a bench trial, decided by a judge rather than a jury. Its job determined whether Meta's conduct had created what the law calls a public nuisance, and if so, what the company would be required to do to fix it. This structure mattered. It meant New Mexico wasn't simply asking for a check. It was asking the legal system to answer two very different questions. Did Meta break consumer protection law? And separately, did Meta's products cause ongoing public harm severe enough to justify a court forcing the company to change how it operates? As the trial date approached in early 2026, Meta's legal team moved to keep as much unfavorable material out of the courtroom as possible. According to court filings reviewed by reporters, the company sought to block references to research on social media's impact on youth mental health, news coverage of teen suicides connected to platform use, information about Meta's finances, the company's history of privacy violations, and even personal details about CEO Mark Zuckerberg's college years. Legal experts who reviewed the requests called them unusually broad, broader than what's typically seen even in a case where the defendant is fighting hard to control the narrative. Among the material Meta specifically wanted excluded, any mention of the company's AI chatbots, a public health warning issued by the former U.S. Surgeon General regarding social media's effects on youth mental health, and internal or external surveys measuring the volume of inappropriate content reaching users on its platforms. The court did not grant Meta everything it asked for. Jury selection began in early February 2026, and the trial that followed would put in front of jurors exactly the kind of material the company had tried to keep out. If you're watching till this point, please like and subscribe because you may never find my content again. In March 2026, the jury returned its decision. They found that Meta had committed 75,000 separate violations of New Mexico's Unfair Practices Act. Jurors concluded the company had misled the public about the safety of its platforms and had failed to protect underage users from predators operating on Facebook and Instagram. The financial penalty, $375 million. It's worth putting that number in context, because on its own, out of context, it can be misread. The state's attorneys had originally sought more than $2 billion in civil penalties. The jury's award was significantly lower than what prosecutors asked for, a detail Meta's defense team would likely point to as a sign the state's case had not fully landed. But the verdict itself, the underlying finding that Meta had broken the law 75,000 times over, stood as the headline result. New Mexico's Department of Justice would later describe the state as the first in the country to defeat a major technology company at trial on claims that its products caused harm to young people. And this was still only phase 1. The bench trial, the fight over whether Meta's platforms constituted a public nuisance and what the company might be ordered to change, was still ahead. Phase 2 began in May 2026, running for several weeks before Santa Fe District Court Judge Brian Beachside. Without a jury in the room, the proceedings turned into a detailed examination of causation. Not simply whether Meta's platforms were associated with harm to children, but whether the state could prove Meta's specific design choices were a driving cause of a mental health crisis already documented among New Mexico's youth. This is historically one of the hardest things to prove in American courts. Public nuisance law was built for the physical world: polluted rivers, contaminated land, unsafe conditions on a piece of property you could walk out and inspect. Applying that same legal framework to an app on a phone required New Mexico's attorneys to draw a direct line between specific engineering decisions inside Meta's platforms and measurable psychological harm happening to real children in their state. The state called expert witnesses from healthcare and mental health fields. Their testimony pointed to New Mexico's shortage of adequate mental health programs and services for young people already suffering the effects of what prosecutors argued was platform-driven harm. The state's presentation connected specific product features, not vague concepts like social media in general, but concrete design choices, to that suffering. Judge Beachside's written ruling, issued in August 2026, named those features directly: endless scrolling, autoplay, push notifications, and algorithmic content recommendation systems. According to the court, Meta had intentionally built these features to maximize the amount of time users, particularly teenagers, spent on its platforms. The ruling found this design contributed to elevated rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, and suicide risk among young users. The court also found that Meta's platforms had contributed to child sexual exploitation and had placed additional strain on the state's schools, law enforcement agencies, and mental health infrastructure. In his written opinion, Judge Beachide wrote a line that would end up quoted in nearly every article covering the ruling, that while Meta is not alone in this regard, its social media platforms are a significant contributing factor to the current mental health crisis among New Mexico's youth, established by the substantial evidence presented in the case. The court's conclusion, Meta's platforms constituted a public nuisance under New Mexico law. With that finding in place, Judge Beachide turned to remedy what Meta would actually be required to do. The court ordered Meta to pay $567 million into what's known as an abatement fund. Unlike a straightforward fine paid to the state treasury, an abatement fund is designed to directly address the harm the court identified. The breakdown, according to the ruling, $420 million for treatment services for those affected, $90 million for screening and assessment programs, $33 million for prevention and public awareness campaigns, $15 million for referral and care coordination services, and $9 million for program oversight and evaluation. The fund is to be paid out over 5 years. Combined with the $375 million jury verdict from Phase 1, Meta's total court-ordered liability in New Mexico now stands at $942 million. But the money was only part of the ruling. The court also imposed structural changes to how Meta must operate its platforms in New Mexico, effective for 5 years. Among the requirements, time limits placed on underage user accounts, likes hidden by default on posts from minors' accounts, visible risk warnings displayed to users, regular banner screens directing users to safety and transparency resources, a state-funded education campaign covering platform risks and parental control tools, strengthened protocols for responding to reports of child sexual abuse material, and new limits on how AI chatbots are permitted to interact with underage users. The court denied one specific request from the state: the appointment of an independent child safety monitor to oversee Meta's ongoing compliance. However, the ruling explicitly left the door open. If Meta fails to meet the requirements laid out in the order, the state retains the right to return to court and seek additional penalties or relief. There was also a boundary the court chose not to cross. Judge Beachide stopped short of mandating hard age verification systems, technology that would require users to prove their age before accessing the platform, something the trial record indicated was likely the single most effective tool available. According to the New Mexico Department of Justice, this was a deliberate decision, not an oversight. The court determined that a policy change of that scale belongs to the legislative and executive branches of government, not to a judge ruling on a single civil case. Attorney General Torres has since said that closing that specific gap is now a matter for the New Mexico legislature to take up directly. Meta has denied the state's allegations throughout the litigation, and has signaled it plans to appeal both the March jury verdict and the August bench trial ruling to the New Mexico Court of Appeals. According to reporting on the company's legal filings, Meta's appeal is expected to argue the case is barred by the First Amendment and by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the federal law that has historically shielded internet platforms from liability for content posted by their users. In public statements responding to earlier phases of the litigation, Meta has said it shares Attorney General's stated commitment to providing teenagers with safe and positive experiences online, pointing to more than 30 tools the company says it has introduced to support teens and their families. An appeal, if successful, could delay or potentially eliminate both the abatement fund payments and the court-ordered platform changes before New Mexico families see any direct benefit from the ruling. New Mexico's Department of Justice has been direct about what it believes this verdict represents. In an official statement following the August ruling, the department said that for the first time, a court has ruled a social media company can be held liable for building products that endanger children, and has ordered the structural changes needed to address it. Legal analysts who have followed the case describe it in similar terms. Because New Mexico built its case using consumer protection and public nuisance law, rather than arguing that Meta's content itself was harmful, an argument that runs directly into First Amendment protections. The state may have found the legal pathway that other states can now follow. At least 40 state attorneys general have filed related lawsuits, alleging Meta played a central role in a broader youth mental health crisis through what they describe as addictive platform design. New Mexico is no longer standing alone in this fight, and it isn't the only front currently active. On August 12, 2026, just days after the New Mexico ruling was issued, a separate federal trial began in Oakland, California. That case consolidates lawsuits from 29 states into a single federal proceeding, with the first phase involving claims brought by California, Colorado, Kentucky, and New Jersey. Meta attempted to delay that trial through an emergency appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The appellate court ruled it lacked jurisdiction to intervene and dismissed Meta's request, clearing the way for the Oakland trial to proceed as scheduled. Separately, in Los Angeles, a jury reached its own verdict in March 2026, finding both Meta and Google negligent in a case brought by families alleging platform-driven harm to their children. Attorneys for the plaintiffs in that case called the verdict a signal that, in their words, the dam is breaking in favor of industry-wide change. For a company with Meta's financial scale, the numbers coming out of New Mexico, $942 million, represent a small fraction of annual profit. The company reported roughly $60 billion in profit in 2025 alone. Investors largely shrugged off the ruling, with Meta's stock moving less than 0.5% in after-hours trading following the announcement. But the state's Department of Justice has argued the significance of this case was never primarily about the dollar figure. It was about proving, in a courtroom, that a company of Meta's size and resources can be held legally accountable for the design choices behind its products, and that a court can order it to change those choices, not simply pay for the consequences of them. 7.5 million pieces of flagged material, 75,000 legal violations, $942 million. 5 years of court-mandated changes to two of the most used apps on the planet. Those are the numbers this case produced. But the number that started it wasn't in any of the official filings. It was smaller, and in some ways harder to look at directly. 3 men arrested after connecting with accounts that state investigators built to look exactly like a child. New Mexico's Attorney General said it himself. It was extraordinarily concerning how easily those men found what they were looking for. Meta has the legal right to challenge both rulings, and under the American legal system, that right stands regardless of what has already been decided in a Santa Fe courtroom. Whatever happens in the Court of Appeals, the trial record from this case, the testimony, the internal figures, the findings written into Judge Beedscheid's order, is now part of the public record. It will not disappear, regardless of how the appeal resolves. And in Oakland, California, as of this week, the next chapter of this story is already underway. Subscribe to Behind the Case File for more true crime investigations covered with accuracy and respect.